What we don't often spend enough time, I don't think anyway, thinking about though, is how different forms of oppression entwine in the lives of the people that we're working with. And I think that's especially important if we think about prevention. If we're talking about building social norms based on respect, we can't afford them to be respectful of some groups of people and not others. We need to be thinking about how we build social norms of respect that cut across gender, cut across class, cut across race, cut across disability, cut across sexuality. So today, here's the name of our panel, that's lovely. I've asked the panel members, now, I'll just put a quick definition of intersectionality up there, the belief that oppressions are linked and cannot be solved alone. I've asked every panel member to address 2 questions in their presentation. Each panel member is going to spend 10 minutes talking, and we will have time at the end for questions. Before we get into the good talking stuff, I'm just going to ask everyone to introduce themselves.
Kia ora, Elizabeth Kerekere from Te Whanawhana Trust.
Kia ora, Robyn Hunt from the Clothesline Project and DCAV. Disability Coalition Against Violence, but I will tell you what it is when I'm talking.
Kia ora, Shasha Ali from Shakti.
Kia ora ana koutou katoa, tōna roto te aroa mata o te toa, Poto Williams from Waipuna.
Kia ora everyone, Marnie Mitchell from the Intersex Trust Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Okay, we're going to start with Elizabeth.
Kia ora koutou katoa, wahine mā, tāne mā, takatāpui mā. I find I'm better able to keep to time if I have notes. Okay, so ngā mihi māhana ki ngā kaitiaki Māori, hei korowai o te kaupapa nei. He te maitiau no te tai rāwhiti, ko rongo whakaata, ko te aitanga māhaki, ko ngai tāmanuhiri, ko Ngāti Onione o kūnei iwi, ko Elizabeth Kerekere tōku ingoa. So, I hail from the stunning place of Turanga Nui Ākiwa, as they like to call Gisborne. And it's hard to see, there are microphone lights. I just see the kids here, I feel like better on this angle. When my father found out that what his brother had done to his daughters, he beat the crap out of him and never spoke to him again. He moved us to Dunedin, to where my mother is from. And so that is where I spent most of my youth. So in the 80s, early 80s, when I was a teenager, I was part of 2 consciousness raising groups, as we called them back then. One was a Māori women's group, which was of many different ages, and one was a young black women's consciousness raising group. We studied the writings of black feminists and lesbian feminists from the States, and we studied Donna Awatere's Māori sovereignty to look how does it apply to our lives. Yeah, I don't know what other people were doing there, 16 and 17, but we researched colonial history and how it applied in the place that many of us had come from other tribal areas to be in Dunedin. And so when others were doing the hikoi to Waitangi, we were on the streets of Dunedin with our little leaflets, which we had cut and pasted, trying to engage the public in Dunedin about the treaty. And so we made t-shirts, badges, we had posters for Africa, we had every hoi, and which is an awesome record now, but it was just a normal part of our lives and what we did. We believed that the colonisation of this country by the British was the underpinning of almost all struggles that happened here, and that we could just honour the treaty and that would sort quite a lot of things out. We dreamed of a nuclear-free and independent Pacific, and we sang and we performed. We marched for homosexual law reform and against nuclear warships in our harbours, and we ran anti-racism and treaty workshops and spoke on all manner of panels. It's it hasn't stopped. The work doesn't stop. And of course, national, regional, and national and local hui. And we hosted activists from all around the world. So I'm very thankful for that experience. One of the highlights for me was hosting Audre Lorde and having time to, and so again I was 18, and having time to just sit down with her for several days and just hang out was definitely a treasure. And so although we were part of both the Māori and the Black women's movements of that time, I don't know for the people who were involved in that remember, we used to get passed down a lot of codes from Auckland to say this is the right way to behave. Yeah, you know it. So we had a few issues with that. So in Dunedin, because we thought, well, we're small. We know we have to work together. We understand that all of our issues are interlinked. So although we were black groups or Māori, we needed to work with the youth groups. We needed to, well, we were youth activists ourselves, but we needed to work with the Christian groups and all the other organisations that were doing things. A key thing was that we always respected that each group needed its own space, its own place, and its own caucus. But also that depending on what the kaupapa was, is we took leadership from that appropriate group and organisation. And so it wasn't idyllic by any means, but I'm really, really thankful for that grounding. It's my politics and how we operate. And of course, the main reason we didn't follow the codes is like, who is Auckland to be telling us what to do? And I don't know how much this is helping me keep the time. But, yeah, no, it's like some of the tactics that we use now, I don't know if I've been softened, but I've certainly been very much influenced by amazing mentors that I've had, because apparently telling somebody not to talk to me until they've sorted out their racism does not necessarily mean that they will do so. And of course, since then, you know, it's a few years ago now, and I've become involved in lots of other kaupapa, and the particular area that is really important to me, in addition to the ending sexual violence, is in the communities of lesbian, gay and trans, bisexual, and particularly for takatapui, which is a traditional term for intimate companion of the same sex. And we have adapted that to include the wide range of identities of sexual orientation and gender identity that are out there. And so I like to think that I'm very inclusive in my separatism. Because yeah, my mother was horrified at 18. I'm like a Māori lesbian feminist separatist. Like, what did I do wrong? And I founded Te Whana Whana Trust as an organisation for takatapui to provide a safe space where we can bring all the parts of ourselves together and have fun, be safe, and to advocate for those issues, but also to bring tikanga into the wider LGBTIQ communities. And so when I look at intersectionality, at the moment I'm doing my PhD on takatapui, because this is an important thing. Like, I know it's been raised in some of the things. If there's not data out there, it's really hard to access funding. And so I thought, well, this will be the biggest piece of research available. So it's like, I'm going to clearly have to do it myself. And so but that gives us a start point. We know the stories, we know the incidents, but until somebody else, half the official things, the acceptable academic papers that are written about takatapui are written by not just non-Māori, but non-New Zealand. And so these are the accepted tomes. And so we need to, just as when you talked about what is, again, like we don't have enough to do, we have to find researchers and add to that body of knowledge, because it's from there that we're able to access a range of other resources. So that's part of it. So intersectionality. I address this in my work because it is definitely a great mechanism for understanding how different oppressions interconnect. It was actually developed, it was coined in 1989 by Kimberlé Crenshaw, who was a feminist of colour in the States, and it was originally done so that feminists and lesbians of colour and black feminists could explain to their white counterparts how gender is actually not the biggest thing for them. And so trying to explain that, yes, all of these other things come into play. And so partly then, that is also quite useful for understanding how it is for for Māori and people of colour and migrant people and all sorts of people who have come and made this country their home. However, the issue I have with it does not include anything about the experience of colonised people, people who have made to become a minority in their own land. It has no analysis around that. We always have to add that analysis into it. And so, because of course, many Māori feminists would agree that perhaps that our status as Indigenous women overrules a lot of other things. Many Takatapu would say that actually most of the discrimination we experience is not because we're lesbian, not because we're gay, it's because we're Māori. And that is a fact that is just the ongoing facts of our lives. And so again, that colonisation, how it rolls out in our everyday life, is actually the underpinning thing. And so as Sans, I really loved the debate kōrero yesterday, amazing, and really made me think about lots of things. So as Sans alluded to yesterday, when we get called sluts, it has nothing to do with our clothing. It is not even anything to do with our sexual behaviour usually. It is to do with centuries of colonisation and the rights of the dominant culture to the bodies of the girls and women in the land that they have colonised. We are another resource for them. And always remember too that we're the last country, I believe, that British colonised, and so it actually was not that long ago. Compared to many other Indigenous people around the world, we've got 2 minutes, no way. Right. Now we're going to be serious. Okay. Right. So, removal of economic base. Finding ways that Māori men unable to express their strength, their mana, finding safe spaces for girls and women because they're not safe in their beds and in their own homes. The rigid gender roles that were brought here through colonisation, all of those things have contributed to all of the things that you are dealing with in your working lives. And of course, as in our case, we were brought up away from home. So that dislocation and that disconnect and loss of culture, loss of language that is occurring throughout because of this kind of issue. So I would say, rather than take a framework which intersects us, which still kind of manages to cut us out, is that we be a bit more tūhono about it, something that connects us back together. And so I would like to suggest then that we look, and as those other speakers have talked about, that we go back to our kaupapa Māori. We'll look at 3 kind of Māori-based frameworks. Number 1 is kaupapa Māori, a theory as developed by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith that says, that underpins that colonisation and the experience as Indigenous people is the underpinning for all things. Number 2, mana wahine, I believe, is that thing that says Māori women are meant to stand beside Māori men, not be subjugated by them, not be beaten by them, most certainly not to be raped by them. And I believe mana wahine is the thing that challenges masculinities and femininities, that says we don't say there is one way to be a man, there is one way to be a woman. I believe it is the basis of the elimination of homophobia and transphobia in this country. Number 3, it's tino rangatiratanga that Māori need to make their own decisions about Māori things. And our last speaker's awesome presentation started giving us some real practical things about what is it. And the other agencies who are non-Māori, you're still dealing with Māori clients, and you're most certainly dealing with the effects of Māori abuse. So, all of the theories in the world mean nothing when you're sitting in a room sitting with someone who's hurting. And so, just as they might not know the correct term for what it is that they're feeling, experiencing, the many, many non-heterosexual people that you will face in your work may not have that name to call what their preferences are and how it gets all mixed up with the sexual abuse and violence that they have experienced. And I know that you have that commitment to be the safe person that they can talk to, and that you will ask the questions that provide that platform to say what needs to be said. And so in conclusion, we may be small, but we are powerful. We have influence throughout the world. If they're going to let Ken into the United Nations, anything can happen. And let us always look for the ways that we connect, the ways that we come together, the ways that we can share our knowledge and our resources. Because I believe there will be an end to sexual violence. It may not come in our lifetime, but this is our land, this is our home, and we are here forever. So to finish, then, I expect people to know this, to join in on the echoes, because fitness is not my strength. Breathing, voice not flash. But so, we are warriors, warriors, the mighty nation, and across the wide, wide creation, we will kneel down. Kneel down. Upon the ground. Upon the ground. Oh, how I love to hear them say my mighty name. Ko te iwi Māori, tātahu, ko te taonga piripono, aunga tūpuna. Ko te aroha, me te mana, me te tino rangatira tanga Kia ora.
Wow, what a hard act to follow. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As a second wave feminist, it's really nice to hear the word feminism used in the way it's being used in these 2 days, because often you hear it used as a term of derision out in the wide world. So thank you guys, all of you. Let me make my thing work. It'll be fun. Okay, I want to begin by stating firmly that I come from a human rights base, and I do all my work from a human rights base, or I attempt to. I might not always succeed. And I believe that human rights, the principles of equality and human rights, is critical for change. And I would say a human rights approach to change includes using all the human rights instruments that we have, that New Zealand has ratified, or maybe only not quite, in the case of the declaration, although they've ratified it, or I forget what they've done. Have they ratified it? Yes, they have. It doesn't have while it doesn't have the force of a convention, you should assume it does and behave accordingly, is my take on things. You know, go with the overt messages. If it's written down on a piece of paper somewhere and some politician referred to it, then go for it. That's my approach. Don't you just love technology? Just went the other way, sorry. This is my attempt for a paperless office. Okay. So also you need to identify all of the human rights involved, and sometimes you have to balance rights. And in that case, you have to take into account the rights of the most vulnerable and the most underprivileged person. An emphasis of participation of individuals and groups in the decision-making that affects them. Non-discrimination amongst individuals and groups. Empowerment of individuals and groups by allowing them to use rights, or empowering them, I should say, not allowing, I hate that word, to use rights as leverage for action and to legitimise their voice in decision-making. Accountability for actions and decisions, which allows individuals and groups to complain about decisions that affect them adversely. Intersectionality, power and sexual violence. Add disability to that particular mix, and where do you begin? It's quite daunting, I have to say. And I can't call myself an expert on almost anything here. Well, maybe I do know a few things about disability, but it is a very complicated issue. For example, in some situations, I'm a person of privilege, in others, I'm not. As a Pākehā middle-class feminist, I'm relatively advantaged and privileged compared to many other women. As a disabled woman, I am not. I'll try and make some sense of all of this with the help of Sisters of Frida, who is a great British blog of disabled feminists. If you Google Sisters of Frida, you'll find them, Frida as in Carlo. So people are oppressed by a variety of different reasons, for a variety of different reasons, such as disability, gender, culture, sexuality, race, and whatnot, and all the rest. There is a lot of overlap between them all, and in areas of, and of course the intersections come in the areas of overlap. Someone who campaigns for disabled people's rights in an intersectional way is aware of that. And that people will be living with more than one kind of oppression. They might be 3 or 4. And the power gap between disabled and non-disabled people is very frequently abused and results in disability-related hate crime, abuse and harassment, while the successful prosecution of such crimes remain woefully low. And in fact, in some parts of the world, people with albinos, are harvested for their remedies. In other words, they are killed so that they can use bits of them for, I don't know, some kind of ritual. It's disgusting. Oh, thank God we're not quite as bad as that here. But we can also see that there's an overlap of identities. People faced extra discrimination, whether it's one or a combination. I'm not going to give you a definition of sexual violence since we've already got one up there, so that will give me a little bit more time. But I would add to where sexual violence occurs in home and at work. And I would add in disability institutions and disability services. If you think the institutions have closed, they haven't. And the abuse goes on. And in fact, I've just reading in the paper this morning where a doctor has refused to work in an institution anymore because it's so unsafe for him and for the staff and for the residents. Since it is widely acknowledged that much sexual violence is about the exertion of power, this is an enormous topic for us. Some of the underpinning causes of powerlessness and oppression of disabled people run deep in pretty much all cultures, according to my international networks. Here are some, usually, but not always unspoken, assumptions relating to disability everywhere because of these things, and this is in no particular order. So these are the assumptions that people make about us. We're weak and powerless, and we won't complain, and if we do, no one will listen. And the last bit is true, no one will listen half the time. We are not as important or as valuable as other people. Disabled women are asexual, don't need reproductive rights, and may even be sterilised to manage menstruation and prevent pregnancy, but not, of course, sexual abuse. We are a source of shame for a family. We don't need education, and no one will employ us anyway, so we're going to have no economic power, and that's true, we don't. We don't need information about health or sexuality because of all of the above. We won't understand anyway. Disabled people are so demanding it will cost too much to do anything to fulfil our rights for respect and dignity, too much extra time, effort and money. This, of course, is always from a point of ignorance. I've just done that again. Talk among yourselves while I find my place here again. Oh wait, I found it. Yeah, we are just a nuisance, make people uncomfortable, feel uncomfortable and are best ignored. Someone else is responsible for looking after them. If we do not have physical access or access to information, we're excluded and invisible. So the cumulative effect of all of this is that we're off the agenda and very frequently othered. I don't have time to explain the socio-religious, cultural and economic reasons behind all this, but a lot of this knowledge comes from my own experience and the experience of many other people of all kinds, disabled people around the world. Only a few days ago, I was informed that for some small NGOs in this sector, there was too much cost, always extra resource over and above everyone else, time and effort involved to include us. So how do we find a way forward? Because I'm not going to whinge the whole time. So how are we going to find a way forward in the context of this gathering and the work we do? What may be helpful is to try and point a way towards collaboration for change. After all, if I'm finding it daunting, it's pretty hard on everyone else as well. So DCAV, the Disability Coalition Against Violence, was formed to promote coalition between disabled people in our organisations, other disability allies, and those providing service and advice to the family violence field to create change. And what Elizabeth said just before about money being invisible and no data and you get no money is so true for us. Really, really struggle. There is one survey out there actually which has been a good start. The Disability Clothesline Project is a way of breaking the silence about domestic and all forms of violence and abuse experienced by disabled people, enabling survivors to give creative expression to their experience as they use clothing as a canvas. And I've got a few information sheets here if people want them afterwards. And I've put some website references up on the board there as well. Disabled people experience abuse and violence at extremely high levels, but this is in effect invisible because it's not acknowledged. The Disability Clothesline Project gathers our stories and experience to bring the invisible into the light in a way that can't be ignored. International research indicates that compared to non-disabled women, disabled women are more likely to be subjected to physical and sexual abuse, have experienced greater levels of violence, and suffered abuse for a longer period of time. Yet disabled women have little access to support and services. And that's just probably Pākehā disabled people, never mind people from other intersections. I can't speak from their perspective because I'm not from their groups. Okay. Disabled men, some of whom are vulnerable, are often forgotten. And of course, disabled children are frequently abused, and disabled men can be perpetrators. People say it's hard to engage with the disability community, but it has to be done. There's no two ways about it. And it's great to have disability on the agenda of the conference and on the registration form, and at least the venue is kind of partially accessible at least. So here are some strategies. Have a roadmap, a plan for inclusion if you're serious, so you don't get overwhelmed and you can chart your progress and steps. Having a policy might help. Read the material that's available. Do your own work. Familiarise yourself with Article 16 of the CRPD, Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Learn about disabled people from disabled people and their own organisations, and really listen, but don't expect to be spoon-fed. I seem to remember hearing all this from Māori at some point. Thanks for the learnings. Google is your friend. The Disability Clothesline also has a resource page. Learn the difference between organisations of and for disabled people and why it matters. Keep an open mind, don't make assumptions. Incorporate universal designs in all you do. Don't just cherry pick impairment types with a, oh, we'll get to you later approach. Do the groundwork to build relationships. Build your own networks. Make your processes accessible so people can be autonomous. Collaborate. Small steps are okay. Okay, I hope I've got time to just talk about the modern meaning of disability. Forget medical models, forget charity models. This is about a rights-based model where disabled people we have impairments, so I don't see very well, other people don't hear very well, some people can't walk very well. Those are our impairments. What disables us is the way society reacts to those impairments and the way society excludes us. That is what is sometimes called the social model, but I just call it a modern understanding of the meaning of disability. So, I'm just whipping through this stuff really quickly. So who we are is okay, it's what happens to us that isn't. I'm not even going to go there. Although I want to talk about good intentions. Often people wring their hands and say, oh, but we meant well. And sometimes I think that's not good enough, really. So, because often the impact of their good intentions is still to make us feel unwelcome and excluded. So what does the intent of our action really matter? if our actions have the impact of furthering the marginalisation or oppression of those around us. The impact of actions, or lack of them, can be profound and far-reaching. As someone, a white bloke I think, once used to say, it's the putting it right that counts. So the answer to that question is, if you, through good intentions but lack of knowledge or whatever, you get it wrong, this is what you need to do. Listen, reflect, empathise, and I don't mean sympathise, yuck, apologise, and don't do it again. And in closing, I'd like to remind you of the catch cry of disabled people all around the world: nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Kia ora everyone. I should stand probably because I'm quite short, but then again the PowerPoint needs to be on the slide. I guess, no, it's okay. I guess most important is whether people can hear me, so if everyone can hear me, that's a good start. That one on your right hand side, Intersectionalities Shakti, yeah, just stay there, yeah, thank you. I want to start by saying that I'm here with my ancestors all across Southeast Asia. I'm here with my foremothers and my grandmothers and my aunties and my mothers that come across the lands that have been colonized, the waters that have been polluted. I'm here because of all the women that have died for speaking out on gender violence that happens in the communities we come from. I'm here to extend the struggle of women of color across the world, and in Aotearoa specifically. And I'm here only because, as a migrant, I have been accessing the privilege of immigration, which has been constructed by Pākehā dominant systems, and invaded and colonized and continue to perpetuate injustices to tangata whenua in Aotearoa. So I opted to be the third person because I'm always kind of like, it's all downhill from here. Because when Sandra invited me to be part of this panel, I was heavily excited. I was like, ooh, this one's a juicy one. And when she told me who she thought of inviting as well on the panel, I was like, ooh, this is going to be good. I guess primarily also because it's a new area that is starting to get a bit of momentum in academic debate and activist knowledge and activist organizing as well, thinking intersectionally. So when people ask me about what Shakti's perspective is on these sort of things, I'm always kind of like, I'm lost for words. I'll just give you a picture. So I stole this picture off a Facebook page, as we all do. Hey, Sandra. Yeah, it's good gems out there. And this is from a People of Color Organized Facebook page. I'm sure it was originated from some other great artist who's remaining anonymous. And the byline for this was, feminism is worthless without intersectionality and inclusion. Now, you can see that these women represented there are visibly of color. And they're all saying we all can do it. And I think that is basically, in a nutshell, what Shakti stands for. People always ask, but what do you guys actually do? And I can give you a spill about how we've been around since 1995 as a women's support group that advocates for the human rights of women and children and vulnerable young people and families from migrant refugee communities of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern origins. But what that really means is that we're all saying we all can do it. So we'll start with that. I also want to acknowledge that, is Sarah here? Sarah, can you stand up, please, hon? So this is Sarah. Sarah's just joined Shakti as well. And Sarah is also part of us. So I want you all to welcome her as one of us. Okay, moving on. I thought since I've only got 10 minutes and counting down now, that I'll start with an example of how we try to practice intersectionality as members of Shakti in the activism that we support in our communities. And one of the milestone events that we organized earlier this year was the silent protest demonstration in solidarity with the rape victims in India. So I'm assuming everyone was aware that obviously rape doesn't just happen in Aotearoa, but also there was specifically a huge global media awareness raising movement that happened in December when, rest in peace, our beloved sister Jyoti Singh Pandey passed on after being brutally raped and gang raped and murdered on a bus in India. Now, I was out of Aotearoa when this happened. I was in Singapore spending time with my extended family, and I kept in touch on Facebook and with all my friends here and a lot of members of Shakti as well. I was like, how many counts of this news is in the media? And they tracked and tracked and tracked. There was nothing on stuff.co.nz. There was nothing on TV3. And then I think it was only like a week after Christmas that there was one little, what was it, 12 seconds. 12 seconds on the media. So one mention of what's happening that's just basically enraged the world. And obviously I couldn't sleep after that. I was like, well, this is not good enough. In terms of organizing, and how come nobody's responding to this, and why is no one speaking out about it? And so we supported a few of our young feminist activists, Asian activists in Auckland, to come together and help us to mobilize this silent protest. And these are some of the pictures from it. I'm glad to say that Wellington picked up on it as well, a little bit, yeah. And he's like, yeah, Shakti, you guys started, awesome. It's like, yeah, you guys gonna do something? Yep, okay. So that sort of catapulted a little bit of a movement as well throughout the country. However, there has been some interesting response when we did the silent protest, and I wanted to share with you what happens when we organize something like that, and why we chose to do something like that, and how people reacted. So these are basically non-Asian, African, Middle Eastern responses to why we did the protest, yeah? One feedback, I'll call it feedback for lack of a better word, was silent protest? Why did you guys decide to do a silent protest? Aren't you reinforcing that we should be silent about rape culture? And I was kind of going, missing the point. Because of course we're there to mourn over the loss of our sisters, because the hurt and the trauma and all that we carry through generations of our sisterhood, the words cannot replace what we're actually carrying. So that was the purpose of silent protest. There was also feedback on, who are you to speak out for Indian women? So here I am standing on behalf of Shakti with my ancestry, which is not necessarily visible to everyone. But people come up to me directly and go, you don't know anything about Indian women, you're not Indian. And then you have to take this feedback with a lot of hurt, but also with a lot of strength. Because you're talking about the subjectivities of Indian women are connected to the experiences of women of color everywhere. And trying to connect our sisters based on that. Now the third point, of course, is our favorite one. So, Slutwalk, hey, kudos to Slutwalk for doing what Slutwalk does. But, when we talked about wanting to organize a protest and we went around with our allies, some of who were organizers in Auckland for Slutwalk, they asked us, do you want us to book Queen Street? Do you want us to, start doing this? And I was like, no, we're just going to do a silent protest. I was like, okay. And then when they came to the protest itself, I actually had this happen. A young, visibly white woman came up to me, and she asked someone else, not me, she asked someone else, she said, would it be okay if I took off my top and write, still not asking for it? Now, this other person that was there was obviously an allied friend of mine, so she was like, I think that's something you need to ask the organizer. Now, firstly, I want to say that is the right response in terms of, for me as a person of color, because for her to say, are you stupid? Don't you know this is colonization again? Aren't you being racist? Because that would be white savior complex, yeah? And we don't appreciate that either. So I was very happy that she referred her to speak to me. And of course, when she spoke to me, I was like, oh my God, this is coming up. Oh, this is excellent. Priceless. And what I told her was, we are mourning. I just said that. We are mourning. And then she felt so shaken up. She was like, oh, okay. She walked away. So yeah, slut walk and the gender busting campaign tactics that we are aware of that happens globally in a lot of Western settler nations and Western countries didn't apply when we wanted to organize. And last but finally not least on the response was we were really excited and appreciative of people coming up with the Rape is a Global Problem banner, because that also linked an added context to the work that we did, that it's not about just the politics and the situation in India, the government lack of resourcing or whatever. It's not about that. It is about the rape culture that exists across the world, and here in Aotearoa it's impacting all our women, including women from migrant refugee communities. Are you serious? Okay. Enter, please. I've got 2 minutes, so I'm just going to skip really fast. But this one is a question to everyone. So people always talk about how do we practice intersectionality when there's so many marginalized groups or groups experiencing marginalization is what I'd prefer. So a question, one of these things was, what does a gender-aware, LGBTQI inclusive, abling, ethnic diverse voice sound like, right? That's a lot of work. And this is a quote that I found in a documentary article on Inside Gay Pakistan. And I really like this quote, and I'll read it out for everyone. So this person was interviewed, and he identifies as a gay person. And he goes, in Pakistan, men are discouraged from having girlfriends. And so often their first sexual experiences will be made with male friends or cousins. This is often seen as part of growing up, and it can be overlooked by families. It's the idea that boys will be boys, he says. And he goes on to say, I think it's selfish for me to come out and campaign for gay rights now. It's selfish to the women in my family who are fighting for education and the right to marry the men of their dreams or not to marry at all. This really shook me personally and shook a lot of the people that I've spoken to about it. Because while it is such a heavy, it's such a heavy discursive quote, he's talking about how community honor is such a huge thing for him. And he's actually trying to articulate that as a male, he has some privilege in the community he's come from. But as a male of a homosexual identity, he also understands that there are other experiences of other women that don't even have the right to a voice in his country. So to me, this is an example of what intersectionally aware cultural response sounds like. I'll just wrap up in the last 2 slides because I really think we need to redefine on how we actually talk about power, because it is about power and sexual violence here. And often when we think about power, we think about binaries and we think about hierarchies that exist in our social systems. But we really need to think about really looking at who exactly are we referring to as a victim. And we all know that victims are on a journey towards survivorhood and thrivehood. So there's been shifts in victim rhetoric. In the past, it's always been kind of like, women in those developing countries need a lot of help from Western nations, yeah? And we forget that the world has changed and left you here. And we forget that there are the frameworks to look at how we can work with victim survivors globally, and especially from the countries that we come from, i.e. Asia, Africa, and Middle East. There's also been tensions in gender discourse, and we know that. The example of our brother there from Inside Gay Pakistan documentary was trying to, surface some of those tensions. It's not an easy thing to talk about, but at the same time, it takes a lot of effort in investing in intergenerational dialogue and cross-cultural, respectful cross-cultural conversations as well. The other points are pretty straightforward, I think, and I really want to jump to the last point, because it's really about also realizing that all these nations that have once been colonized by the British or the Germans or the Portuguese or whatsoever from Europe, there is now a movement of us being more aware about our colonized histories. And so there is a movement that we can leverage on and work connecting with globally. We don't have to rely on necessary traditional allies to gather resources or rawa in our communities. So in the spirit of imagining the solution, Sandra, I thought it would be really good to put a slide there at the end. As a member of Shakti, I often see myself, observing things as a relatively new person in Shakti as well. How we collaborate really matters. Who we choose to collaborate with really matters. And I know the pink elephant in the room is always about funding. It's always about resources and how competitive it is for us to sustain our services. But we really need to ask ourselves, are we just looking for funding and resources to support the communities that we come from? And if we do that, how we do ensure that it reaches social justice outcomes that's equitable, right? So it shouldn't be 50-50. It should be some people need 70%, some people need 25%. And really, the mainstream population only needs 10%, really, if you think about it. Working cross-sectorally, so I think it was really good to be a member of Toanes Tawiwi Caucus Advisory Group for the past year and a bit, because it gave us also opportunities to link in some of the issues that we work in family violence that still needs awareness in other sectors as well. And I think the best thing to think about is looking at social inclusiveness. So we talk about gender equality as if it's just this one construct, and I'm sure all the members of this panel will inform you that that's not the way to go. We're really looking for a socially inclusive gender equality framework. That's it, really.
Tō te tūpuna pakari kua akapua pinga I te mau o te inua. The wisdom of the parents provided the usefulness of the land. I'm not very good at following instructions. So when Sandra asked me to be part of this panel, I thought, it's a good opportunity for me to express some of my concern about the hidden secret in the Pacific community, the secret we don't talk about. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about the hidden secret. And I hope you don't mind if I stand, because I might have to run, because some of this stuff is pretty controversial. We haven't really lifted the lid. So I feel I'm safe. I feel I'm amongst friends. I don't want to offend my Ainga Pacifica, but some of what I have to say, I think, is real, comes from the heart. So, but I don't propose to speak on behalf of all Pacific. I can only speak on behalf of myself. But I might have a useful perspective in terms of the discussion around oppression and vulnerability to sexual violence, and how sometimes our culture does not become helpful in the healing. I've got to point out there's a great diversity amongst Pacific cultures. There's probably more that's different about us than is similar. That's a bit of a concern, really, because there's no universal way of working with Pacifica. There's an understanding of Pacific peoples of each other, but it's not ideal. And, you know, that question I pose to myself is, when is culture not helpful in the healing? When Pacific people encounter services that are ethnic specific, and there's a few of them, you might find that they're wary of who they will work with within those services because of those kin connections. They're usually easily identified just by saying their name. To Pacific people, your name is the first marker to locate you within your community, within your family, within your village. And depending on the nature of your need, could cause a whole lot of embarrassment. This could be whakamā, as we say. You have opened a can of worms, of which you are no longer able to control. The genie is out of the bottle, and worse, the minister's wife might get to hear of it. The Pacific culture is not an unchanging organism. It has the ability to evolve and change. However, as a way of asserting Pacific culture and in relation to our very recent colonial past, there's a very felt need amongst Pacific people to preserve and defend the culture to ensure its survival. I've often heard many of my friends say of their own culture that New Zealand Samoans are more Samoan than the Samoans back in Samoa. That's true. We have largely lost our history, and there are those of us who do not understand the nuance of language because we've been brought up speaking English. We remember the histories that we rely on are those that were written by missionaries and historians through vastly different lens. And there are those who claim that practice outside of this cultural framework can be discredited as being foreign or Western, and that expressions of children's rights or women's rights can give rise to this response. Let's look at the recent response of church ministers to the Marriage Amendment Bill. The fear was that we would be doing irrevocable damage to the Pacific way of being. Some can claim that in terms of gender relations in Pacific cultures, this has already happened over the last 2 centuries. For example, the imposition of Christian beliefs on marriage, family, sexuality, gender roles, and women's positions within the family. Social attitudes make it difficult to have communication on reproductive and sexual health matters. So information, support and advice on these matters is limited, and sometimes it's not always welcomed. When information is power, barriers to accessing this power limit our ability to comprehend the risk that the world poses to us. Though many Pacific cultures consider or profess to consider children as gifts, the status of children is closely related to the status of women. The commonly accepted practice of disciplining children with physical force obviously clashes with the notions of protecting children. Parents vehemently defending the use of physical punishment as part of culture, that it's an essential part of respect and care for the family. So through punishment, children learn the proper way to behave, so they don't become an oddity. Children are generally expected to be obedient to parents, relatives, elders, community leaders, not to shame their family or parents, and to respect culture and traditions. This obedient and subsequent voicelessness means children are not heard and furthermore discouraged from giving voice to any concerns, especially should it involve adults, and they're unlikely to be believed anyway. Conformity is a construct not often remarked upon in Pacific communities. Though not explicit, it's a significant part of the expression in Pacific cultures. In communities where tolerance of difference is low or non-existent, the choice is made by those who feel ridiculed, shamed or afraid can be severe. And sometimes we're talking suicide. The root causes of the high rates of suicide amongst Pacific is not often analysed, as suicide is seen as shameful, something to be hidden, rather than inviting serious discussion on the causes and ways that families and communities can respond to this. The issues of social conformity include the voicelessness, the use of violence on children and women, intolerance of individuality or difference. They're seldom raised as discussion of discussions of Pacific culture or human rights. Sorry, it's pretty damning really, isn't it? Common to all Pacific cultures, of course, is the concept of the extended family, where family is expected to consist of more than just the parents and immediate relations. They consist of the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, cousins, and those with loose and close kin connections. The extended family is expected to play a positive role in raising the young children and providing social and family stability. However, there's one account that Morton gives of culture and family relations in Tonga that describes the depth of inculcation of learning of culture and identity of a Tongan child that's based on living in a community as well as living in a family. Our culture provides the basis with which we indoctrinate our children with our culture. To stand outside of that framework means to isolate yourself from your family and your community. How children are disciplined, responses to children's emotions and crying, methods of instilling obedience and appropriate behaviour for a girl child and a boy child are all culturally determined. It's important to understand the relationships that exist, say for example in Tonga between a brother and a sister, that can be closer and stronger than any other familial relationship, with the inherent problems that can pose. So that relationship between brother and sister can be stronger than that between mother and child. In the context of urbanisation, migration for work, difficulties in employment and income, and having impact on our communities, our families and our children. Marriage breakup, new partners are putting children in the middle of relationships, and we all know about what the studies of non-biological members into the family can pose. Now, I'm going to take a big deep breath around this one. The church. The church plays a significant role in determining acceptable practices and behaviours, and are likely the first source of intervention when a family or an individual is in distress. The church is also one key influence for the maintenance of traditions and rituals, and the Pacific way of being is inexorably linked with the church. It's the first port of call for families in trouble. The church can often keep a lid on situations that threaten to disestablish or destabilise the accepted norms, while attempting to remediate individuals and families and force them to conform. Okay, just about done. 2 paragraphs. It's well known that church leaders will often ask victims to forgive, that the use of prayer will heal as long as the parties are willing. Navigating through the church, whose main concern is not for the individual well-being but for the preservation of ideals and ways of being, potentially and often isolates the victims from support. Finally, the impact of young Pacific people brought up in New Zealand in responding from a westernised and modern perspective to the values and practice imposed upon them to produce conformity. Young people have always challenged accepted norms, but up against the rigidity of cultures fearful of the diminishing value to their community, the cultural divide threatens and can potentially blow our communities apart. Ka kite o mata, kare te waa e kai. Your eyes will see, but your mouth will not eat. You see what you should, but somehow you will never get it. Nei taki māta e kia manuia.
You know, I talk all around the world, and I normally talk very easily and confidently, and I will today, but I will hold my child self, who is in absolute terror. And before I start today, I want to think about all of those who are not here listening to this. Those who have passed by their own hands, because the pain and the darkness was too much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm aware of the burden on my shoulders as I speak and break silence for those of us who are different, who are born with bodies that are not typically male or female, and to hold it in the context of what we're talking about today, which is sexual violence. I want to acknowledge one of my mentor and anchor people, because I speak to you today both as a survivor of sexual abuse and as a clinician. And Anna Salter and her amazing work is, as I say, one of my anchor places. And in the introduction to this book, she talks about a book about secrecy and deception, because secrecy is the lifeblood of sexual aggression. And I guess what we're doing here today is we are speaking. We are bringing light into dark places. So when we talk about those of us who are intersex, I will start by talking about my own story. So a child born in 1953. I grew up in rural New Zealand beside the Whanganui River in a rural community, but I was born in Auckland. And moments after I was born, I was identified as was called in those days incorrectly a hermaphrodite child. My mum was screaming. She was taken away and sedated. And I was taken by the doctors to try and work out whether I was a boy or a girl, because that's really important, isn't it? The child wasn't given nurturing or comfort. And those doctors who examined me and put their fingers inside me, was that sexual abuse or was it something else? And we're talking about intersectionalities here and boundaries, and I think we have to think very carefully about what is constructed and what is okay and what is not okay and what is lawful and what is not lawful. And I can assure you, as a child, I didn't know the difference, that what doctors did to me was okay and lawful, and what the perpetrators did was not okay and not lawful. Perpetrators are very skillful at working out who their victims will be. And I want to acknowledge and honour my fellow panellists here. And it's no coincidence that those of us who are standing and voicing are from marginalised groups. For whatever reason. Because the perpetrators know where to go, the people who won't speak. And it's those of us, for whatever reason, are disconnected from our bodies, from our hearts, from the earth, from who we are. And there are many processes that do that. And if we are truly going to address this issue of sexual abuse, it's as communities, as people, to go back, and I want to acknowledge the panellists that spoke before lunch, and go back to that ancient, old knowledge that every single one of us is a taonga, is precious. And how do we do that so that we know ourselves, that old knowledge, and that those around us are operating out of that place? Because sexual abuse can't happen. It was said before, and that is absolutely right. You cannot do it. The person who first abused me was a school teacher. And he was right. It was 40 years before I broke my silence. And when my sister, who is 6 years younger than me, woke up in the school teacher's bed, she wasn't ashamed. She went home and told Mum. And a month later, that teacher left the district to go, I presume, to another one, which was the way in the 1950s. We just moved the perpetrators around. But my sister had that sense of herself and feeling okay about herself, so she went home and told Mum. My sense was that I'd been told to be ashamed of who I was, that my body was not okay. I loved my parents, and I thought that I had failed them because I had allowed somebody to touch my body, and I'd been told that wasn't okay. So I'm coming back. What are we going to do to change it? We're going to have a world where every single child is precious, and we teach the mums and we teach the dads how to do that again. Because it is again. We have known that in the past. And I think every single culture, for all kinds of reasons, has forgotten that. And I hold my hand up, include my own Western culture. It has forgotten it. So finally, what I want to conclude with the intersex issue, we have a medical treatment system that says different bodies are not okay. We right now continue to give women who are identified as having CAH children a drug called dexamethasone. And the reason is we're going to stop virilization in babies, because having a virilized female baby is such a terrible thing because they might possibly be lesbian. And so another part of what I want to add to what I'm talking about today is we need to address homophobia and transphobia in our community. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so I'm lucky enough to know all of the fabulous people on this panel, so I knew when I invited them that this would be extraordinary. I wonder if we can just take a moment before we have questions to thank everybody on the panel for their bravery and the stories that they are sharing with us. I am a bit speechless, to be honest, about what's just been shared, so if we could do that.